When most people think about the slave trade, what usually comes to the mind is the transatlantic slave trade and its many horrors. But there is another part of history that is less talked about, a slave trade that lasted for more than 1,000 years and stretched across Africa, the Middle East and beyond. This is the story of the Arab slave trade, also known as the Trans-Saharan slave trade. It began even before European countries started sailing to Africa. As early as the 7th century, after the rise of Islam, Arab traders built large trading networks across the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea and the Sahara Desert. Unlike the transatlantic slave trade, which mainly sends enslaved people to the Americas, the Arab slave trade spread Africans across the North Africa, the Middle East, Persia, India and parts of Europe. Those traded included black Africans, Turks, Iranians, Europeans and Berbers. The trade was active across much of the Arab world, especially in Western Asia, North Africa, East Africa and parts of Europe. This fast trade endured for roughly 17th centuries, from 7th century CE to the mid-20th century, far longer than the transatlantic slave trade, and resulted in the first displacement of millions of Africans. Originating in the late 600s CE and persisting in diminished form into the 1900s, it constituted one of history's largest and most enduring migrations of enslaved people. By some estimates, between 6 to 10 million African men, women and children were taken in this trade over its long span. Unlike the Atlantic trade, which was concentrated over a few centuries, the Trans-Saharan slave trade was a protracted, evolving phenomenon, understudied compared to its Atlantic counterparts, yet equally devastating in its human toll. In this documentary, we explore the origins, expansion, mechanics and impact of the Trans-Saharan slave trade, following its trajectory from ancient times through its height and eventual suppression. Slavery and trade in human beings were not new to Africa or the Mediterranean world when the Trans-Saharan route emerged. Isolated instances of Trans-Saharan slave trading date back to Antiquity. As early as Pharaonic Egypt in 3rd millennium BCE, rulers like Pharaoh Neferu raided Nubia in today's Sudan for captives, dragging African slaves northward up the Nile. Ancient Saharan societies such as the Garamantes of the Fesa in present-day Libya also enslaved people from sub-Sahara region. The Greek historian Herodotus noted that the Garamantes hunted down cave-dwelling Ethiopians with chariots to enslave them. During the Roman Empire, North African markets, e.g. at Lepsis Magna and Carthage, traded in slaves bought across the deserts. Some historians believe the Roman demand for labor may have involved significant numbers of African slaves, though evidence is limited. However, these ancient instances of Saharan slave trafficking were sporadic and small-scale. The formidable Sahara Desert formed a natural barrier, and regular trans-Saharan commerce did not flourish until the introduction of the camel. Camels arriving in North Africa by the early century CE made long desert crossing feasible on a larger scale. Still, before the 7th century, the flow of slaves across the Sahara remained limited, an arduous and rare enterprise relative to what it would become. The turning point came with the rise of Islam in the 7th century. The early Islamic conquest and the expansion of trade networks under Muslim rule gave new impetus to trans-Saharan commerce, including the slave trade. In 642 CE, Arabs' armies conquered Egypt. Soon after, they pressed south along the line. By 652 CE, the Muslim governor of Egypt had forced the Christian kingdom of Nubia in Makura into a treaty known as the Pact. Under this pact, one of the earliest records of an organized Saharan slave trade, the Nubian agreed to deliver a yearly tribute of slaves, often said to be around 400 per year, to the Arab rulers in Egypt. This arrangement essentially formalized a perpetual pipeline of enslaved Africans from the Sudan to the Islamic world. It marked the commencement of the trans-Saharan slave trade in a systematic way. From the late 7th and 8th centuries onward, as Islam spread across North Africa and into the Sahara, fueled ideologically by the expansion of Dar es Salaam and economically by the need of the growing Muslim empires, Arab and Berber merchants, now with better technology, the camel caravans and a religious commercial impetus, began linking the Mediterranean economy to sub-Saharan Africa via well-trodden desert routes. In short, Islamic expansion accentuated the slave trade, It opened vast new markets for African slaves in North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. By the medieval period from 8th to 15th centuries, the trans-Saharan slave trade had grown into a major component of African global relations. During this era, the trade route across the desert became tightly woven into the fabric of West Africa and Saharan commerce. Muslim geographers of the time describe a thriving exchange. Caravan would bring textile, horses, salt and other goods southward and carry back gold, ivory and enslaved people northward. The best-known route ran from the fringes of the Sahara in the west, the Sahel zone, to the great commercial cities of North Africa. The black line indicates main caravan routes across the Sahara, linking regions such as the Niger River Valley and Lake Chad Basin to North African centers like Marrakesh, Tripoli, and Cairo. Dotted line shows secondary routes and feeder paths, while a later 19th century route towards Benghazi is the dashed dot line. These arduous paths stretch over hundreds of miles of desert with crucial oases such as Sejumasa, Gadames, Gat, Mozouk, Kufra, and so on, serving as staging posts for the caravans. Among the primary corridor was a western route from the Senegambia and Mali region northward to Morocco. Caravans from the Niger Bend, Timbuktu, and Gao trudged northwest to Sejumasa and Marrakesh, carrying slaves and goods in exchange for Saharan salt and Maghrebi goods. A central route ran from the Lake Chad area in the Kanem-Borno Empire and Hausa lands, straight north through the Fezzan, passing Sawila, Gat, and Gadames to reach Tripoli or Tunis. Further east, route connected the Upper Nile Valley and Darfur or Kordofan region to Egypt, via both overland caravan and river transport on the Nile. In practice, the Sahara trade network was a web of interconnected legs. Goods and people were often traded multiple times along the way, passing through the hands of different middlemen in a series of stages. A captive might be sold in a Syrian market to a Tuareg merchant, then handed off at a Saharan oasis to a Berber merchant, and eventually end up in a slave market in Tripoli or Cairo. African captives were marched in camel caravans over enormous distances, sometimes thousands of kilometers, to reach the slave markets of the north. This segmented, relay-style system meant the trade could tap source regions deep in sub-Saharan Africa. Over time, North Africa and Arab traders forged new links even further south, pulling captives from early West African kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, Songhai, the Central Sudan in the Kanem-Borno Empire and Hausa state, and even the forested region of Africa, such as the Oyos and the Dahomey, into the trans-Saharan slave supply. The scale of the medieval trade was substantial. Historian Paul Lovejoy estimates that around 6 million black slaves were transported across the Sahara between 650 and 1500 CE. If accurate, this averaged to several thousand enslaved people per year over those centuries. Contemporary observers confirm that slaves form a significant part of the Saharan commerce. Ibn Battuta, the famous 14th century Moroccan traveler, encountered abundant slaves during his journeys in West Africa. In the Kingdom of Mali in 1350s, he noted that the locals vied with each other in the numbers of slaves and servants they had, and the king himself presented Ibn Battuta with a slave boy as a hospitality gift. On Ibn Battuta's return caravan across the desert in 1353, he traveled with a huge convoy of 600 black female slaves bound for Morocco, destined to be sold as housemaid, servants or concubine in the royal court. These vivid accounts underscore how routine and organized the trafficking had become by the 14th century. Other medieval writers also document the trade. The 9th century Arab geographer Yaqubi wrote that black kings were selling their own people without pretext and without war to Arab traders. And in the 12th century, Al-Idrisi observed that some African groups raided their neighbors to capture people and sell them by the dozen to merchants. In short, by the late Middle Ages, the slave trade was deeply entrenched in trans-Saharan commerce, involving a complex network of African suppliers and North African or Arab purchasers. The major African kingdoms and states of the Sahel both suffered from and participated in this trade. War and slave raiding intensified as states sought captives to supply the markets. For example, the Kanem-Borno Empire located around Lake Chad rose to prominence in part by exploiting the trans-Saharan slave trade. By controlling the caravan route north to Libya, the kings of Kanem could profit immensely from slave exports. It is recorded that by the late 1400s, Kanem-Borno was trading roughly 5,000 captives annually across the desert. Its rulers justified this raid ideologically as jihad against non-Muslim neighboring peoples, thereby framing slave raiding as a religious sanctioned activity. Other states like the Mali Empire and later Songhai also exported slaves, though gold was their primary export. Horses and weapons were a particularly coveted import for African rulers. In one account, the Sultan of Borno would accept only horses as payment for slaves, trading up to 20 slaves for a single horse, reflecting how valuable horses for cavalry were in the savannah states. Thus, the Trans-Saharan trade became a motor of political and military change in West Africa. It enriched certain kingdoms but also required constant warfare and raiding, destabilizing regions and fueling conflict to obtain captives. African elites like some Songhai and Hausa chiefs and later the rulers of Kanem Borno became active participants, selling prisoners of war or victims of raid to North African merchants. Meanwhile, nomadic people of the Sahara, the Berbers and Tuareg, played an essential role as guides, caravan leaders and desert intermediaries. They had the expertise to navigate the harsh Sahara and were often allied with or paid by North African traders to ensure the caravan success. The Tuareg, for instance, guided routes and operated as a critical link between the Sahel sources and Maghreb markets, earning tribute for safe passage. The trek across the Sahara was itself one of the most harrowing aspects of the trans-Saharan slave trade. Enslaved Africans, men, women and children were typically forced to march in long caravans, tied together in coffles or shackled for weeks on end under brutal conditions. Survival was uncertain. The Sahara's extremes of heat and lack of water, as well as abuse from captors, meant that many captives never made it to the slave markets alive. European explorers and observers in the 19th century recorded ghastly evidence of this. The German traveler Gustav Nachtiger, crossing the desert, reported encountering numerous skeletons and bone littering the sands near dried up water wells, grim remnants of slave caravans that had perished of thirst. Nachtiger estimated that for every slave who reached the auction block, 3 or 4 others had died or escaped along the way. Another explorer, Heinrich Barth, noted cases like a Saharan overlord losing 40 slaves to cold exposure in a single night when temperature plummeted in the desert. Such accounts suggested extremely high mortality rate for a trans-Saharan journey, possibly on the orders of 20 to 75% attrition depending on conditions. Slave traders were often ruthless in driving their human cargo to keep moving. One British observer in Libya, G.F. Lyon, described how caravan masters constantly whipped and brutalized the captives to compel them onward. Lyon noted with horror that if a slave fell ill or collapsed, the trader might attempt to remedy it by burning the slave's belly with a red-hot iron, a cruel torture meant to shock the victim back on their feet. If the person still could not continue, they would simply be left to die in the desert. Such inhumane treatment was commonplace, thus reconciling to themselves their cruel treatment of these unfortunate creatures. Lyon remarked acidly of the slavers. Slaves were given minimal foods and water, just enough to survive each day. Many marched barefoot across burning sands and rocky ground, developing swollen and bleeding feet. Some caravans traveled by night to avoid daytime heat, but then had to endure freezing temperature by early morning. Those too weak to keep up were often abandoned, and the caravan would press on without pause. It was not uncommon for an entire group of slaves to perish en route if an oasis was missed or a well ran dry. The Sahara could be merciless. Sometimes a whole caravan could disappear without a trace, as contemporary reports attested. It is important to note that slave traders profited only if enough captives survived to be sold. So they had a financial incentive to deliver as many healthy slaves as possible. Yet the vast distance and harsh environment made losses almost inevitable. Caravans typically included dozens to hundreds of slaves and would be accompanied by armed guards to prevent escape or raid by desert brigands, and camels carrying trade goods, water and provisions. The journey from the Sudan to the Maghreb or Egypt could take several months. Slaves were often multi-purpose porters during this trek as well. They might be forced to carry ivory, salt or other goods on their back while also being matched nuts to be sold. In this way, traders skilled labor out of the captives even before selling them. Despite such measures, the cost in human life was staggering. A British consul in the mid-1800s calculated that even by that late date, 2/3 of all goods reaching Tripoli from the interiors were slaves, implying a constant influx but also suggesting many lives lost to maintain that flow. The high mortality meant that to deliver one slave alive, several had to be captured initially to account for losses, magnifying the devastation on the source communities. Upon arrival in North Africa or Middle Eastern markets, enslaved Africans faced uncertain futures across a variety of roles. The Trans-Saharan slave trade supplied many different sectors of society, which in turn influenced the demographic of who was taken. Unlike the transatlantic trade, which primarily demanded young male laborers for plantation, the Trans-Saharan trade had a higher demand for female slaves and for certain specialized male slaves. Indeed, women and girls are believed to have made up a large portion, possibly even the majority, of those enslaved via the Sahara routes. They were typically destined for domestic service and concubinage in the household of North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and the Arab world. In the slave markets of Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, Cairo, and so on, buyers could inspect and bid on slaves in open auction, often held in public squares or souks. Youthful women and girls who were deemed attractive were highly valued as concubines or maids for wealthy men. Many ended up in royal courts or affluent harems, serving as attendants to wives or becoming secondary wives or concubines themselves. Enslaved women were also commonly tasked with household chores, raising children and other domestic duties for their owners. Enslaved men and boys, on the other hand, were channeled into a more diverse array of work. Labor-intensive tasks awaited many. They might become agricultural laborers, tending crops or animals, porters and transport workers, hauling goods, or servants attending to everyday needs. In the Sahara itself, slaves were used in salt mines and oases for heavy labor. For example, in the notorious salt mines of Tagaza in Mali or Bilma, and further afield in the salt marshes near Basra in Iraq, where East African slaves toiled in horrific conditions. In fact, the oppressive work in Basra salt flats led to one of the largest slave uprisings in history, the Zanj Rebellion in 1868 to 1883, in which tens of thousands of black slaves in southern Iraq revolted against the Abbasid Caliphate. This rebellion, though ultimately crushed, is a stark reminder of the presence of African slaves throughout the Islamic world and the extremes of exploitations they faced. Notably, a significant subset of male slaves were turned into eunuchs, a practice particularly associated with Trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean slave trades. Wealthy rulers and merchants in the Middle East and North Africa prized eunuchs, castrated male slaves as harem guards, palace servants, administrators, and tutors. Because Islamic law generally forbids the act of castration, this mutilation was often carried out prior to the slaves' arrival in Islamic territories. Many young boys were castrated in the Sudan or in transit by slave traders, or sometimes in slave depots at the fringes of the Sahara, so that they could be sold for a premium price in places like Egypt, Turkey, or Arabia. Contemporary sources note that a eunuch could fetch up to 7 times the price of an uncastrated male slave, reflecting their high demand in elite households. These eunuchs often serve as keepers of harems, guarding the women, or as high-status servants and confidants in royal courts. The process of creating them was extremely brutal, often resulting in death from infection for a larger percentage of boys. Yet the practice persisted for centuries as a feature of the Trans-Saharan slave system. Beyond domestic and menial labor, some African slaves were trained or utilized as soldiers and military slaves. In North African dynasty, for instance, black slaves were sometimes formed into units. The medieval Zirid dynasty of Ivriqiya in Tunisia employed Sudanese slave troops imported via Trans-Saharan routes. In Morocco, by the 18th century, the Abid al-Bukhari were a famous corps of black slave soldiers loyal to the Sultan. Even further afield, the Ottoman Empire integrated African slaves in various support roles. Though the more famous slave soldiers of the Islamic world, like the Mamluks or Janissaries, tended to be of European or Caucasian origin. Still, in certain regions of the Arab world, Africans and their descendants became an important part of the military and guard units. Crucially, the line between slavery and freedom could sometimes blur in these societies, depending on a slave's role. A minority of slaves, especially those in administrative or military positions, could attain influence or even be freed after years of service. However, for the vast majority, domestic servants, concubines, laborers, slavery was a permanent, hereditary status. Children born to enslaved women were often themselves considered slaves unless acknowledged by a free father. Indeed, the perpetuation of the enslaved population through childbirth was a notable aspect. Unlike the Atlantic trade, where enslaved Africans were usually worked to death without reproduction, in the Islamic world, female slaves' offspring could increase the slave population. Many women were forced to bear children, sometimes fathered by owners or overseers, thereby breeding new generations of slaves. This practice helped sustain the slave supply internally. The attitudes that underpin this system were in part racialized and religious. Muslim intellectuals hotly debated the ethics of slavery. While Islamic law technically forbade enslaving freeborn Muslims, in practice, race and religion became conflicted. Blacks from south of the Sahara were presumed to be non-Muslims even when they were Muslim, and some jurists and writers claimed scriptural justification for their enslavements. The myth of the cause of harm, the notion that blacks were caused to servitude, was cited both in Islamic and Christian contexts to rationalize enslaving Africans. By the late medieval period, a dark skin became so associated with slave status in North Africa and the Middle East that even free black Muslims faced prejudice. One 14th century account notes that a Muslim sultan of Borno in today's Nigeria, writing to the Mamluk ruler of Egypt, protesting the constant raids by Arab slave catchers on his kingdom's Muslim population, a plea that largely fell on deaf ears. This indicates that by that time, the demand for slaves overrode religious solidarity, and black Muslims were not exempt from enslavement by virtues of their faiths. Slavery in the Trans-Saharan context thus had a distinctly racial character, especially in later century, even if the initial justification was religious difference. As the world entered the early modern period, the Trans-Saharan slave trade both changed and persisted in the face of new global dynamics. In the 15th and 16th centuries, European maritime powers, Portugal, Spain, and others began trading along the West African coast, inaugurating the Atlantic slave trade. This new Atlantic route gradually diverted some of West African slave exports from the overland Saharan route to coastal ships. West African kingdoms like Dahomey, Oyo, and Ashanti that arose in the 1600s to 1700s increasingly catered to European demand, selling captives to European slavers at coastal forts. This did have an impact on the Trans-Saharan route. Some regions that once sent slaves north, for example Senegambia, now send most to the Atlantic, causing a reorientation of slave flows. However, the Trans-Saharan slave trade did not disappear. In fact, in the 18th century, certain Saharan routes saw a resurgence of slave trading activity. This was partly because conflict and chaos in Africa increased the overall supply of captives. Wars stoked by the Atlantic trade produced prisoners, some of whom, if not sold to the Europeans, could be sold across the desert. Additionally, new Islamic states and jihad in West Africa, such as the Sokoto Caliphate expansion in the early 1800s, generated waves of enslaved people, many of whom were routed northward. Historical data suggests an uptick by the 18th century. Trans-Saharan slave trade was climbing again, even as Atlantic exports reached their peak. One reason was that North African and Middle Eastern demand for slaves remained strong, especially for certain types, for example, eunuchs and concubines, that the Atlantic plantation market did not prioritize. North African traders adapted by sourcing slaves from areas less touched by the Atlantic trade, such as the Lake Chad region, the Nile Basin, and the Horn of Africa. They also penetrated further into West African interior to avoid competition from European coastal buyers. By the 19th century, when the transatlantic trade was being gradually outlawed, the trans-Saharan trade actually hit one of its highest crescendos. Ironically, the era of abolition in West Africa in the 19th century saw the trans-Saharan slave trade persist and even intensify in certain areas. Although European powers were moving to end the Atlantic slave trade in the 1800s, the demand for slaves within Africa and the Middle East was still robust. In the 1830s, observers recorded that the slave trading was flourishing in the Central Sahara. The oasis town of Gadames in Libya was handling over 2,500 slaves per year in the 1830s alone. It is estimated that roughly 1.2 million Africans were taken across the Sahara in the 19th century, a number that rivaled the peak century of the Atlantic trade. By the 1850s and 1860s, French and British anti-slavery officials reported caravans of extraordinary scale. One British consul noted that nearly 10,000 slaves were likely being trafficked to North Africa each year by the mid-19th century. The routes to Tripoli, Benghazi and Cairo were especially active, fed by ongoing slave raiding in the Sahel and the Sudan. European explorers like David Livingstone in East Africa and Henrik Barth in the Sahara gave eyewitness testimony to the solving of these caravans, which helped to galvanize anti-slavery sentiment back in Europe. But on the ground, local authorities often turn a blind eye. For example, though the Ottoman governor of Tripoli officially banned slave export in 1857, it was not enforced. Slave convoy continued to depart Feza and the Sahara with the authorities' tacit approval well into the 1880s. Despite growing international pressure, slave markets were still active in North Africa into the late 19th and early 20th century, especially in regions outside direct European colonial control. Morocco, for instance, had not been colonized yet in the 19th century and maintained legal slavery until the early 1900s. European travelers in the 1890s and 1900s could still witness slave sales in cities like Marrakesh. The above illustration from a French newspaper 1907 issue shows a bustling slave auction in Morocco, where Arab buyers examine African slaves openly. Such scenes, sensationalized in the press, underscore how the Trans-Saharan slave trade outlived the Atlantic trade by several decades. Throughout the 19th century, the sources of slaves shifted somewhat. With the Atlantic trade suppressed by the 1850s, more captives from West African conflict could be funneled north. In East Africa, the Arab-Swahili slave trade centered on Zanzibar also boomed, sending slaves into the Indian Ocean world and across Sudan to North Africa. Notably, in the 1800s, the famous slave raider Al-Subai Rahman in the Bahr el-Gaza in southern Sudan captured tens of thousands to fill the demands in Egypt and North Africa. Even as the European colonial scramble for Africa began in 1880s to 1890s, some areas like the Deep Sahara remained beyond colonial reach. The slavers took advantage of that. European anti-slavery patrol mostly focused on the coast to stop maritime trade, and along the line, the desert routes were added to police. However, by the late 19th and 20th centuries, the nose was tightening on the Trans-Saharan trade. France, after occupying Algeria in 1830 and Tunisia in 1881 and pushing into the Sahara, actively tried to stamp out slave convoy in its territories. The French and British mounted military campaigns against slave raiding strongholds. For instance, the French war against Samori Touré in West Africa in 1890s had an anti-slavery element, as Samori traded slaves north. In 1890, a Brussels Conference of Colonial Powers formally condemned the African slave trade and agreed to cooperate to end it. By the early 1900s, French colonial forces in Sahara and Sudan were intercepting caravans and freeing slaves. The Italian conquest of Libya in 1911 likewise led to crackdowns on slave trading routes in the Fezzan and Kufra oases. Italian reports from the 1920s noted that they had freed hundreds of slaves in the raids on Kufra slave market, which had been an Islamic order stronghold for slave trafficking. In one operation in 1929, Italian authorities claimed to have liberated about 900 slaves from the Kufra area, finally shuttering what had been one of the last open slave markets in the Sahara. Even so, clandestine trading persisted a bit longer in the remote pockets. A daring Danish traveler, Not Ombo, crossed the Libyan desert in 1930 and reported that locals in Kufra quietly informed him slavery was still practiced there. He was even told he could purchase an enslaved girl for about £30 at the Eden market. These remnants were essentially the last gasps of the Trans-Saharan slave trade. By the 1930s, with the entire Sahara under French, Italian, Spanish or British surveillance, any overt slave caravan activity became nearly impossible. Colonial authorities patrolled wells and routes by aircraft and camel corps and imposed harsh penalties on slave trafficking. The institution of slavery itself was also being abolished by edict. Tunisia in 1846 had abolished slavery, being the first Muslim country to do so. Algeria French administration outlawed it in 1848. Egypt, under British pressure, officially banned slave trading around 1877. Morocco and the Ottoman Empire issued prohibition by the early 20th century. The final country in the Sahara sphere to outlaw slavery was Mauritania in 1981, though enforcement there remained weak for years. Thus, by the mid-20th century, around 1950 to 1960, Trans-Saharan slave trade had effectively been extinguished, closing a dark chapter of African history. It had begun in the mid-600s CE with conquering armies and ended with the intervention of modern colonial states, an uncomfortable symmetry of foreign domination at both start and finish. In the 1980s, however, during the Second Sudanese Civil War, the slave trade in Sudan came back. This was under the control of the National Islamic Front, especially involving groups like the Bekara and the Rezegat. Slavery also returned in Libya after 2011, when the Libyan civil war led to the fall of Muammar Gaddafi's government. The war, supported by NATO and anti-Gaddafi's forces, left Libya unstable. Because of this chaos, many migrants, especially those with little money and no identity papers, became easy targets. Libya became a major route for African migrants trying to reach Europe. In April 2017, the International Organization for Migration (IOM) released a report showing that many West African migrants going through Libya were being sold as slaves. People smugglers and militia groups would detain them, then sell them in slave markets across Libya. Migrants from African countries south of Libya were especially targeted and brought into these markets. Victims said that migrants with skills like painting and tiling were sold at higher prices. Many slaves were held for ransom, and until the money was paid, they were often tortured, forced to work, sometimes until they died, and in some cases executed or left to starve. Women were usually raped, used as sex slaves, and sold to brothel or private Libyan buyers. Many child migrants were also abused and raped. In 2017, CNN received a video showing a slave auction happening in Libya. A woman trafficker told Al Jazeera that hundreds of migrants were being bought and sold in different parts of the country every week. Migrants who had been through Libyan detention center reported extreme abuse. They suffered electric shocks, burns, beating, and even scaring. A Libyan gang known as the Asma Boys had been attacking migrants from other parts of Africa since at least the year 2000, including destroying their belongings. In January 2018, Nigerian migrants gave first-hand stories of the abuse they experienced in Libyan detention centers. Some were leased out or sold as slaves. Later, video began to appear on social media showing Sudanese migrants being burned and whipped while being held for ransom by traffickers. In June 2018, the United Nations placed sanctions on 4 Libyans, including a Coast Guard commander and 2 Eritreans for leading slave trade network in the country. The effect of the Trans-Saharan slave trade are still seen today. In places like Morocco, Tunisia, Sudan, and Mali, the descendants of enslaved Africans are all part of the population, but many of them still face discrimination and are often pushed aside in their communities. The impact of the Trans-Saharan slave trade are deep and long-standing. It caused the movement of millions of Africa into northern lands. Even today, there are visible communities of African descent living in North Africa and the Middle East. These include the Aratin in Morocco and Mauritania, as well as people in Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Arabia, Iraq, and Iran, who trace their roots to African slaves. Historical records from as early as the 16th and 17th centuries mention large African populations in cities like Cairo, Tunis, and Istanbul. The cultural and genetic influence of these Africans is still present. For example, the Gnawa musicians of Morocco maintain musical and spiritual tradition that comes from West Africa. In areas like Balochistan, in what is now southwest Pakistan and Iran, communities such as the Sidi or Makrani still practice customs linked to their East African ancestors who were brought there through the slave trade. Across the Arab Islamic world, African traditions, music, stories, and religious practice spread widely. Despite their sovereigns, enslaved Africans and their descendants shaped the society they were forced into. They worked in royal courts and armies, and they influenced local cultures through dance, cooking, rituals, and storytelling. For sub-Saharan Africa, both the Trans-Saharan and the transatlantic slave trades brought major damage. This trade took away a large number of young and able people, creating long-term insecurity. In many regions, the constant threat of slave raids and wars made life unstable. Some scholars believe this loss of people slowed the development of African societies and left them more vulnerable to later colonial conquest. By the time European powers moved deeper into the continent, many African communities had already been weakened or divided by the effects of slavery. The trauma also left social scars. Some groups are taking part in capturing others, leading to long-standing mistrust between communities. In some places, the descendants of slaves became an oppressed and lower classes in their own society. By studying this long and painful history, we honor the millions who suffered and gain a better understanding of how deeply connected Africa is to the rest of the world. The Trans-Saharan slave trade crossed the continent and beyond, leaving a permanent mark on world history. Thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful, please like, share and subscribe for more untold stories from African history.